Welcome back. We had a great discussion last time and we're ready to pick up right where we left off. So, Mr. Stewart, tell me about your entry into Simcoe County and how you became engaged with the Collingwood path.
Well, my background basically is in the YMCA Sport and Leisure. I worked 10 years with the City of North York Parks and Recreation as a supervisor, but we were also given cultural as well. And when the opportunity came for me to move to Simcoe County, which who wouldn't want to move to Simcoe County with all due respect, I jumped at it. And I was given the portfolio of the geographic of Simcoe County, which includes, at that time, 28 municipalities and 2 cities. And our job was to basically do the organizational development and the community development I mentioned earlier, but also the funding. As Catherine mentioned, the funding tool we had at our disposal, which in the beginning was Ontario, which I think everybody remembers. And we had a few other programs that came along now and again. Our job was basically to do the intelligence gathering of who out there needed the money, and our job was to make sure that that money got to those organizations, whether they be arts, culture, sports, fitness, or recreation. Because a lot of community organizations don't know where to go. They don't even know what's going on in the next municipality in terms of, is there a like organization over there? Maybe we can benefit from that, which is another one of our roles, as we were called consultants then, is to bring organizations, like organizations together to share communication, make them stronger, and maybe collectively get a bigger bang for the buck, and which is one of the reasons why arts councils got together, because they, as a collective, people that are involved in arts councils, artists and so forth, they're concerned with their art. It's hard, creatively, it's hard for them sometimes to think of beyond their workshop. So an arts council, basically the purpose of one initially is to have a collective voice for the arts and culture in the community. So basically that's why I got here, and I found that I was working less and less in the sport and rec sector, because as you say, Peter, with Ontario happening in '75, they were generally taken care of in terms of infrastructure. The tennis courts were there, the baseball diamonds were there, and the municipalities gradually took over the responsibility of any future construction of those facilities. So, but the burgeoning arts and culture sector was just sort of at the beginning. When I first got to Collingwood, and one of my first jobs through council, through your office, I believe, was to basically look at all the studies that had been done in town of Collingwood related to arts and culture. And studies are great because they provide research that hopefully will lever council decision making into doing something. But there were 16 different studies. And I think I finished the project, I think it was the early 90s, and I presented the findings through your office, as you recall. Everything from a civic center, I'm sure you folks remember that, an arts center. Well, there were 16 different research studies paid for in part by the province and paid for in part by the municipalities that dealt with culture. In terms of sport and recreation in Collingwood, at the same time, there might have been 1 or 2 leisure plans. And interestingly enough, guess what was a major component of the second leisure master plan was culture. And interestingly enough, again, it was the only section of the plan that council received, accepted, and acted upon with no question. So I tried to do that 35 years ago and you wouldn't see it. But 16 or 17 different studies basically committed just to the development of arts and culture in the community, and as well as Penny's involvement with the good organization, the Blue Mountain Foundation for the Arts, which I think they
still exist today.
They're getting in their 45th year up there now. It's formed in '75, I think. But I mean, that's incredible. They're considered to be one of the grandparents of arts and culture in Ontario. And if anybody wants to see how it works, go to see the Blue Mountain Foundation in Collingwood. Don't attend their meetings because they're pretty crazy, but go and see them in action.
Not that they haven't changed through the years either. You know, when you look at what they began with to what they provide today and what sort of offshoots. I mean, within Collingwood, Theatre Collingwood grew out of the BMFA. The Landscape School of Painting grew out of the BMFA. So you could sort of launch like-minded cultural organizations. But before, when you were talking about coming off the farm and playing ball or quilting, it brought to mind for me one of the annual sort of celebrations of everything brought together was always the fall fair of the Agricultural Society, wherever. And I mean, the GNE's in its 165th year or something this year. 160 something. And if you go to the GNE, they have a quilt section, a sewing section. We did artwork in school. They had an art show of the kids' work. They have adult artwork. They now have photography sections. So it's all, probably your agricultural annual fair is probably the microcosm of what the community, your community looks like. And that would be a really great place for anyone who's sort of starting to look at who's in the community to go to a fall fair.
Absolutely.
It's interesting to know too that the sport and recreation as a legitimate professional type thing came out of the University of Guelph,
Yes.
the agricultural program, because they were finding that more students were registering for non-agricultural courses and more leisure courses, so they literally created a whole program, sport and leisure, which became accredited in '67 through the community colleges, and now you can get it at university. So I think Catherine made an earlier point as to the professionalism of community organizations, how they've changed, you know, so much, through the years. But yeah, if you go in and if you just ask a regular person what they're involved with, you know, what do you like to do? What are your hobbies, and what are your interests? And you'd be surprised the you know.
And we have so many
cornucopia of stuff you get.
resources within the communities now. In terms, from the municipal side, there's usually some form of recreation, sport and culture department. There's your local library. They foster the love of reading, of writing, and they've moved into having display space for artwork. Like, it's interesting to see the development and the crossover. I can remember.
And the partnerships.
And the partnerships. In the previous location of the Collingwood Library, when they put an addition on one end, they put a multi-purpose room. Very rapidly, the multi-purpose room became a room for art shows because it had enough contiguous wall space that you could hang a show, taking it outside of any private gallery in town. And then that fostered different types of juried shows, different ways of individual artists showing their work, which was something they didn't have prior to that.
No.
And that was something the municipality began to offer, which was that old concept of exposing yourself to art. So everybody who walked through the front door of the library invariably would walk around the gallery space, look at whatever show was there. They probably didn't go. They probably went to were going to get a book for their child's homework or something to read, but they did up the art show, and it developed, and it sort of planted a seed with them that this was interesting, and it might lead them to an organization, it might lead them to a painting class, and those are the sorts of things that larger municipalities offer classes in. In the smaller communities, organizations, and usually volunteer organizations, are the ones who offer those types of classes. They manage, they run them, and then we've turned into a burgeoning artists community.
What I think the arts and cultural community needs to do a better job of, not necessarily in every community, is to demonstrate, and it's a dreaded word, but it's necessary, the economic impact of what arts and culture means to Collingwood.
Yep.
And because with all due respect, elected officials understand dollars and cents. They understand roads, pipes, dollars and cents.
Yes.
So if you can demonstrate that, and it's not something that happens overnight. It's a transitional process that builds and builds and builds. And this is where the networking comes in, I think, in terms of our arts councils and arts organizations getting together. City of Barrie, for instance, is pretty well sold on arts and culture. In the old days, the Sport and Rec Committee would go to council in the old days, 40s, 50s, 60s, ask for a new arena and hope for it. Well, they're pretty well set now. They can ask for a new arena and they get it.
Yep.
Because they can throw the numbers, they can throw the economic benefits of tournaments as a result of that arena, et cetera. Even though there's not an arena in the province that breaks even or even makes money, with all due respect, unless they're private. But the arts community, in Barrie, the arts community, and I'm kind of removed from it now, but they produced a cultural plan about 10 years ago that basically is considered one of the blueprints for cultural development across the province. I mean, our ministries couldn't wait to get their hands on it to say, okay, what did they do? Okay, let's cookie cutter this and make sure other communities know about this. But any arts organization, and you can just read the newspaper and what's going on in Barrie in terms of theater, 3 or 4 theater companies, Lord knows how many artist communes are happening. I mean, art is burgeoning. I mean, the McLaren Arts Center.
Yeah.
I mean, the McLaren Arts Center, and Catherine knows much more
Yeah,
about this than
yes.
I do. You know, that didn't exist 15 years ago. It was an idea,
Yeah.
but it didn't exist. But now look at it. I mean, that kind of stuff is just
And I
just
think
incredible.
the thing that's interesting,
And excuse me, Penny,
Yep,
before you go
yep.
on, they haven't built another arena in Barrie, but they built an art center. They built
Yeah.
an arts gallery. So what does that
Yeah.
tell you?
Good
And
point.
a
Yeah.
theater, the Mady Theater.
The Mady
And the
Theater, yeah.
Mady, yeah.
The converted bank. That's right. Sorry, Penny.
which is now the Five Points Theater,
That's right.
because they
That's
went
right.
the naming rights route, and now it's presented by, it's Pratt Homes.
Was it proud? Okay.
Yeah, it's interesting, but as you were talking, the one thing that is the absolute intangible for any municipality to define what is art and culture, what is the definition? Because you could put, we'll all have a different definition of it. But one of the things that has grown up in the province of Ontario are festivals. And whether it's a week long or whatever, but Collingwood is kind of known for a little thing that's had 24 years now, known as the Elvis Festival. And when you mention economic drivers, that has a very tangible economic impact on Collingwood when it happens the weekend before the long weekend in August, every summer. And we have up to anywhere between 80 or 110 tribute artists who come into the community. And it's interesting because arts and culture has also developed that it's part of your quality of life, but it's also part of your tourism factor, which is another thing that has developed in Ontario, the whole concept of cultural tourism. And whether it's going to Niagara on the Lake to have wine and go to the Shaw Theatre, or it's to come to Collingwood and have Elvis and then go up to the mountain and take the gondola rides. That's all a part
And
of,
enjoy all the public art that's around.
and enjoy the
Yeah.
public art that's around. Every municipality will have a different definition, but I think festivals are the one thing that have been thrown in. And I mean, in the theatrical world, the two beacons of light are the Shaw and the Stratford festivals. They are the little festivals that started either in subpar conditions and grew as a dream, and they're now a mainstay and an economic driver within a municipality, to something like the Elvis Festival in Collingwood. So,
There's one other element that, coming back to your question of what is the culture of our community, every community is different. Our community has a history of shipbuilding. That's part of the culture of our community. In my working life, I enjoyed tremendously working with communities that were looking to define what their culture was. I worked with one community where ice fishing was a really important part of their community culture. Every winter, there were all sorts of ice fishing huts out on the lake that this community was adjacent to, and they had an ice fishing festival. And when they got around to do cultural planning in their community, the top cultural identity element that they came up with was that they were an ice fishing community. And everything else fell into place
yeah.
once they discovered that about themselves. It was wonderful. It's a lakefront community, it's a beach community in the summer, but the really important element was ice fishing. So it's not always music, it's not always Elvis. There's one other thing that I'd like to come back to that I don't think we've quite elevated into the conversation yet about what is the culture of a community. Most communities have a museum of some sort.
True.
And mostly they're pretty closely associated with the municipality. Sometimes they're a direct operation of the municipality, but not always. And a very rewarding part of our job from the province was to try to foster that relationship if it wasn't direct. Not only is a museum a place to go and look at artifacts, but it's a collection of the heritage of the community. That can be artifacts, that can be photographs, that can be stories. And one of the things I'm most proud of in my volunteer experience with our municipality, with Collingwood, was being part of an arts and culture advisory committee that recommended to our council at the time, and they took the recommendation, to delve into the archives of the museum and make the council chamber into a cultural gallery which displayed the heritage and the culture of our community here in Collingwood. So there are portraits of Admiral Collingwood, there are line drawings by a very talented local artist of local buildings, there are artifacts, and so every time our council now meets, they're surrounded on the walls of the council chamber with the heritage of our community. I think that's a wonderful thing, and it's very cultural, and it's very immediate, and it's extremely associated with our local place. I'll just make the final point here before handing it off again, is that culture is about place. Culture is local. It's about who we are in our community, however we define that to be. And anyone who's looking to go into this profession would want to have that at the forefront of their thinking as they start to delve into what's the culture of this place? How do I make connections? How do I build partnerships? How do I get groups to come and work with me in my department to make it specifically about this place and build up the cultural element of the department so that it's relevant to the place, because it's always about the local place.
Fabulous point.
One of the issues or problems that I've always struggled with is how do you raise the profile of culture in a community or tourism in a community? How do you raise the profile of anything in a community? Does it take an individual? Does it take an organization? Does it take an event? Or all of the above, or whatever?
Or
And
does
why
it
is
take a
it some?
network of committed people?
Possibly. I think if, a great challenge for your class at school would be to come up with a litmus test or a blueprint for the ingredients that need to be in place before something culturally happens in a community. And what are they?
I was going to ask you, and it's a marvelous segue, Mr. Stewart. I was going to ask you to reflect back on those days when the four of us sat around and said, we've got to have a big meeting of all the artists of all description and character and tell them what we're trying to do here. And I can't remember which one of you said it, but it was like, it was a challenge because it was like herding cats. Because artists, by definition, are free-thinking, non-structured. I just want to do my art. I don't want to have any details with administration.
Resist
Please
government.
don't bother
Resist
me.
government
Resist
intervention.
the government.
Yeah.
It's always stifling me. So from that time that we said, no, we got to do this. This is the fundamental first block in building something, and it did grow. But the champions, who do you recall as champions that made this transition and helped that original desire to have a committee of representative artists help design where we, the municipality, were going to?
Well, I think three of them are sitting right here.
I do too.
Penny for her
I mean,
involvement
the
with
thing
Blue
that I
Mountain.
find interesting is when you talk about artists and whether they be people who sing in choirs or study music on their own, whether they're a painter, they're in the artistic expression mode. In order to get organized, and artistic expression is here and organization is here. They can do their own thing over here, but they can't quite always articulate. So what you needed to find was a combination of people who had an interest in the arts to balance with the artistic people. So we needed the Kathy and the Gregs who had the government mindset. We needed some of the people who had risen within the different arts organizations. I think of Barb Wider from Theatre Collingwood, Sheila Metris, who was deeply involved with
Economic
Theatre
development.
Collingwood, but also she was, my dad called her Little Miss Information. She was the Georgian Triangle Tourist Information Center. And what we started to find, if you could get the people who had, as I always say, day jobs, that are out there in the business world who have the interest in the arts, they can bring a different sensibility when you start to collect people, when you start herding those. We were all cats. We were all being herded. And by the time you can herd them into a group and start talking about this issue, and you always started with one question. whatever that question was. And everybody started, and eventually there was either a Kathy or a Greg or a Peter with a flip chart. Okay, so the key points are, and eventually everybody sort of all agreed on the key points.
So
and
a
then it was an
driver,
evolution.
a
Yeah, it was
driver.
an evolution.
Or the ability to present what is possible.
Yes.
To think
And I-
outside
Well, to
the
think
geographic boundary of
also in
Collingwood.
an organizational aspect.
And get past turf.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Turf wars were big things in the early
They,
years.
they still are. They're
Yeah.
very powerful
Yeah.
stuff.
So
Yeah.
that balance of finding the raw artist expression with a business-minded associate person was key. Having somebody that understands the artist, but walks the government regimentation of getting things done. It always
There's
seemed
always a champion or a catalyst of some sort. And for your class, you don't know where that's going to come from necessarily.
absolutely
That
right.
might come from something associated with economic development. It might come from someone who really, really wants a theater in town. It might come from someone who absolutely loves the heritage downtown Main Street and wants that to be celebrated, preserved, and built out from. One of the best examples I've ever heard of a catalyst that came from an unusual place was Prince Edward County. That's in eastern Ontario. It's entirely rural. It's a county administration. The municipal level is at the county. They hired an economic development consultant to try to attract business to this very rural, low-income county. The guy who got the job, his name is Dan Taylor, did all the planning process, all the inventorying, talking to all the people, talking to all the groups, all of the things that we've touched on here, came back to the county council and said, I will never forget this phrase, you are culture rich and appreciation poor.
Yeah.
You are never going to attract a factory here, but what you have, you are overflowing with culture. If you develop what you already have, develop its capacity, make it such that people, they have the capacity to attract tourism, you will have an economic development plan that's exploding. And anyone who's familiar with Prince Edward County now knows there's theater, there are beaches, it's rural, there's farmstead tourism,
Bike
there's
tours.
wineries,
Huge bike
Wineries.
tours.
there's culinary tourism, there's
Yes.
bicycle trips, there's kayaking. That's all part of what was already there or waiting to be developed. Beautiful, beautiful heritage villages, lovely landscape. And that's all part of the culture of that place. And that was an economic development plan when the original catalyst was hiring a guy to try to get somehow the municipal capacity built to attract a factory. And it turned out to be culture.
That's called a 90-degree turn.
It's one of the best catalyst stories I've ever heard. So I'm not answering your specific question about what's the champion, but I think the point I'm trying to make is you're never quite sure where it's going to come from, but it'll come from somewhere if you unleash the forces. And that's what maybe your class would want to know if they're going into a municipal parks, recreation, and culture type of role.
Not to be have a preconceived thought of where it's going to come from. It's just the inventory first.
Yeah.
That's
Find
right.
out the good
And
parcels.
it'll jump
Environmental
up
scan.
and hit you over the head.
And sometimes the inventory is people. I mean, I think Collingwood took the example, and I think, I'm not sure whose brainiac idea it was, but the group of 25. So finding a group of 25 people who all
Key
had
informant people.
Key informant people who had an interest in it. I mean, Kathy, you were on it. I was invited to it. I think of Farrell
Greg.
Anderson, a dentist in town who has a love of music, who sings in choirs. So he brought his perspective, so and Barb Wider, Sheila, you started to draw all
People
these
from
people
the
together.
museum,
Yeah.
people from the heritage community who loved the built heritage, the historic downtown. That was all part of that group.
And one of the keys, and I remember this to be a big argument, was you didn't have to be a taxpayer from the town of Collingwood.
Right.
We
Right.
did encourage those on the periphery of Collingwood to help us, because we knew, us, four of us, we knew that you couldn't put a blanket over top of the town of Collingwood and cover all the people who had given great
Yeah.
impact and helped us along. So
I mean-
that was a wise thing that we did.
In the same way, if you use Prince Edward as an example, Prince Edward County, Collingwood is sort of the natural center of what was known as the South, it's now the South Georgian Bay, but it was the Georgian Triangle. Whether you go as far as Meaford, over to Wasaga Beach, down to Creemore, we had around, bounded by the bay, we had this triangle, and there was a lot of people lived here but did this. They played ball there, they acted in Meaford, they, you know, there culture knows no real lines,
Absolutely.
Right.
and I think that
Only politicians are
only
concerned about boundaries.
that's right. So that's where it comes down to funding, but in terms of planning and doing, if I think back to the annual art tour that used to be done by the BMFA, you would go from visual artist to visual artist to visual artist. And through the years it grew. I mean, the first year I think there were maybe a dozen sites. The final year it was done, there were probably 50 sites, and they had guest artists in each and every one. You could no longer do it in a weekend. You couldn't see all of them. So it's an idea that grew, it morphed, it changed, but it didn't stop at county lines, it didn't stop at town lines. And it's just really interesting to see that that's one thing that culture has that a lot of sport and rec doesn't, because you play in your town and, you know, Collingwood plays against Stainer and Stainer plays against Clearview, and as you start to go around. But within the groups, culturally, it's a like-minded thought.
Folks, we're right out of time right now. We're going to have to stop now and continue at another time.